Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm absolutely delighted to be with all of you today. What a privilege it is for me to be your moderator for this following session, where we have a tremendous number of fascinating speakers. My name is Eleanor McMahon. I'm CEO of the Trans-Canada Trail, and I'm delighted to be invited to join you here today. I want to thank Janet, some team, for putting on an amazing conversation, and again, inviting me to join you for part of it. We do have a Menti question that I know you're all scrambling to answer as part of today's ongoing conversation. And I'm going to ask that we present the results of that question, which of course was asked earlier, to tell us about some of your favorite protected areas and special places in Ontario. And so if we could have those results now, that would be great. As those are coming up, I'll share a few that I learned of in advance. They're ones that all of us know of: Georgian Bay, Hanlon Creek, Guelph, Killarney. And since I'm coming to you today from the shores of Georgian Bay, that's really, I join in that love of Georgian Bay, and more broadly, and certainly Killarney is a spectacular place. So I think that presentation is coming. Let's at my end. There we go. Here's some wonderful responses. Temagami, Blueberry Mountain, beautiful. Torrance Barrens, spectacular. The Bruce Peninsula, so many beautiful places for us to visit and see in Ontario, and of course, special and important that they've been protected. So that's a wonderful way to start today's session, because we have 6 or 7 actually fabulous speakers to talk to you about the Carolinian zone, session entitled Carolinian Zone. So I'm going to kick it off by introducing our first speaker, the MP for Windsor West, Brian Masse, is going to talk to us about Ojibway shores and the concept of a national urban park for Windsor. Brian's been advocating for this for some time. I've had the privilege, as a former Windsorite, I grew up in Windsor, of walking this along the shores of Ojibway. I enjoyed in my childhood. And Brian is just a tremendous representative for the area. So Brian, I'm going to we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you for allowing me to say some words here at the People's Summit. I want to thank everybody joining us today. I'm in a makeshift office because mine just got flooded this morning, and so I want to let people know that that's a little bit of a different background for me. And then on top of that, later in the presentations, if I have to do this with my phone, it's because I'm actually voting later online in the House of Commons. We have the virtual vote, so don't feel slighted if I take a moment and do that when they do come up after 3 o'clock. This is an exciting opportunity for me to participate, and I want to first acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nations, which include the Ojibway, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. We respect the longstanding relationship with First Nations peoples in this place, in the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits of Detroit of Detroit. And before I proceed with more specifics here, I want to impress upon the quest here we have for a national urban park. Is also part of, I think, a quest across the globe to deal with climate change, but also to find places for people. And I was always impressed by Michelle Pryor. She's the president of the National Parks Association of Queensland in Australia. And she's wrote this with regards to the benefits of national park, and quote Michelle: "National parks are a national achievement and a cornerstone of a modern enlightened society. Not only are national parks famous worldwide and form part of our national identity, they provide an abundance of benefits reclaimed from the past as a legacy for the future. They're a fundamental aspect of life today. National parks protect our natural heritage, a magnificent spectrum of spectacular landscapes and unique wildlife, while also contributing significantly to our personal health and well-being. They are a major draw in the annual nature-based tourism industry, and also provide valuable ecosystem services, protecting our water catchments and moderating our climate. National parks have the most generous form of land tenure available, being publicly available to all. They attract millions of people each year. A simple walk in a protected forest has been shown to lower blood pressure, improve the immune system. National parks connect us to our country, our land. They contribute to the bridging of the gap between the traditional peoples and those who have come after. They provide a place of refuge from our fast-paced and often stressful lives, and are invaluable in counterbalancing urban life." And I think that this map that you see here, I want to thank the Wildlands Leagues for putting this together. Really exemplifies, I think, a unique opportunity that we have in this area to form a national park that is unique because of the environmental and biodiversity, but also by the nature of it. So I do want to take a moment to let you get adjusted to the map here. The yellow piece of property is the proposed Ojibway Shores property that we've been fighting for to protect from the Windsor Port Authority. I'll get into that more later. But just above that is what's called Sandwich Town. And Sandwich Town is the oldest European Western settlement western of Montreal in Canada, and it's very historic in nature. It's also got major significant economic and social challenges. It's one of the highest poverty rates for children and has a lot of newcomers. And it's also one of the greatest opportunities for urban renewal that comes with this park system. And just next to the yellow again is the new Gordie Howe International Bridge that's being built. It's going to be finished in a couple of years from now. This is a project where I had my first public meeting back on this in 1998, because right now the current crossing runs right through the city of Windsor and is owned by a private American billionaire. And this new public crossing finally had some community benefits as well too, which was important for the community for Sandwich Town. So the proposed Ojibway National Urban Park is here in Windsor, Ontario, and has a long history with especially the protecting and fighting to make sure it has a future. And it has several essential components to unite the park system together. The proposal includes combining several of Windsor's parks, a provincial tall grass prairie, along with the land piece and shoreline, which is owned by the federal government, being the Windsor Port Authority, the yellow piece I mentioned. The total would be approximately 900 acres. And the components are the following. Ojibway Shores, which is, much I mentioned, the yellow piece, is a vital 33-acre green space and the last remaining undeveloped natural shoreline in Windsor, Ontario. It is a home for hundreds of endangered species that rely on migration through the surrounding local parks for survival. It is currently owned by the Windsor Port Authority, and that's a federal crown corporation. And I would also reinforce that we own this as Canadians because it is actually a crown corporation. And then there's also a Ojibway Prairie complex, and the complex is a collective of 5 different natural areas within a 10-minute drive of Windsor's downtown. It's part of the green complex that you'll see that run up from the map there from the river. That involves the Ojibway Park, the Tallgrass Prairie Heritage Park, Black Oaks Heritage Park, and the Spring Garden Natural Area for a total of approximately 244 acres, or hectares, which is 604 acres. And collectively, these sites are designated as the Ojibway Prairie Remnants Area of Natural Scientific Interest. The nearby Ontario Prairie Provincial Nature Reserve, owned by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, adds more than 105 hectares or 230 acres of additional prairie savanna. And the most striking aspect of the Ojibway Prairie Complex is a tremendous variety of its vegetation and animal life. We have wetlands, forests, savanna, and prairie provide habitat for a great number of rare plants, insects, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The prairie landscape is characterized by a lack of trees, but it also includes grasses and flowers that grow very tall and lush, hence the name tall grass prairies. We also have the Spring Garden Natural Area. This is designated as part of the Ojibway Prairie Remnants of Natural and Scientific Interest by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. It's also recognized by the Essex Region Conservation Authority. Many of the species there are rare or threatened, and they include the purple orchid, American chestnut, calkroot, dense blazing star, wild indigo, duskwing butterfly, Duke skipper, redhead woodpecker, and gray fox. There's others as well too, but I was on city council when we had a chance to purchase this property back. It was actually going to be developed, it wasn't. We also have the Black Oak Heritage Park, which is right next to the yellow. It's the first green on the map next to the yellow. And that's also a city park, and it has a whole bunch of different important species that connect it right to the Spring Garden Nancy. And what's really cool about this situation is that if we get not the Spring Garden Nancy, sorry, the Ojibway Shores, if we get there, you can see the connections already take place. If you're actually down on the ground there, you can walk between those 2 areas. There's a fence that try to dissuades people from doing it, but there's a trail system there already set. We also have the Tallgrass Prairie Heritage Park. That's very important. It has a series of different other endangered species, but the record of species was done by John McCown in an 1892 collection of in Canada, and he did some of the inventory there that still exists today. It was part of the foundation of what we've had. We also have Ojibway Park and the Ojibway Provincial Nature Reserve as part of this complex. And I think one of the things I do want to spend a moment to talk about as another aspect is the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge. So back in the day, there's a movement in the United States, which I'm vice chair of the Canada-US Parliamentary Association, where we help join with them to actually getting some of this area identified. And in 2004, the Refuge acquired the Humberg Marsh, a 410-acre unit situated at Trenton and Gibraltar, Michigan. And as well, too, there's been a number of different initiatives that have actually created opportunities for us internationally for this. And so that was actually one of the interesting things, is that, you know, when we had a public meeting, and I want to thank, there's Jonathan and I know there's so many others that were here, the Wildlands League, Janet was there, and others. We actually even had American officials and representations from their official park system presenting to us in Windsor about that. Now, about 12 years ago, residents banded together to fight the Port Authority for this piece of property, being the Ojibway Natural Shores on the Detroit River there. And it's interesting, Kieran McKenzie's with me here. He was with me as a city councillor, and sorry, as a constituents assistant before a councillor. And long story short, it came down to the Windsor Port Authority wanting to bulldoze that site and cut it down, and they were going to do a swap deal to help build the new parkway access. So the developer was going to get to be able to drop their fill in there and save $1 million, and then they would actually get this land developed. We fought that as a community. It was amazing. And then I remember with Kieran, with the last minute, there still was some suspicion as to whether it's going to go forth. And so I called the developer and told the developer about what was happening. And the developer backed off and let me go to the public meeting to inform the Port Authority that they had no longer had a partner in this process. And Kieran and I went and celebrated afterwards. And we had a beer at a local pub, or Rock Bottom, afterwards, and toasted, "We stole your dirt," because that was all the infill they were going to get from this new parkway system. The developer, to his credit, gave up about $1 million, and the port no longer can actually develop this. And since then, there's been several groups that have gotten in there to actually inventory the species, and it actually meets 9 of the 10 provincial criteria because of the wetland, the significance, and a whole series of biodiversity that is so incredible. It was originally described as scrub brush by the Port Authority at that time. So I've been consistently pushing this in the House of Commons and as well in the community, but this has been community led. In fact, we've had hundreds of people at the meeting that we had, one of the last ones before COVID-19. Thousands of people have signed on to petitions, have written. We've had subsequent meetings and a whole series of different ventures. The Friends of the Rouge as well too have been very important with regards to helping us out in this process. So I want to conclude. I only have a couple more minutes here to impress about the unique opportunity that we have. Again, you know, the Prime Minister has even said to union leaders, because we have the union behind this, which sometimes is, you know, is in the foresight, is incredibly important, because people before myself, like the late Rick Coronado and others, have been doing amazing work for us and combining the union together with the community. And that we have an opportunity here that's so significant. It's low-hanging fruit. When you have all these properties that are publicly owned one way or another together, and the amount of consensus we have there is much different than the Rouge. And the Rouge has had to go through a series of private and other types of investors, and they've done amazing work, and they've been great mentors on this. But I want to just stress that this is such a unique opportunity for us to do now, and why I've been pushing for it as a national urban park. And I want the Prime Minister's words, and especially when he put in the speech from the throne that national urban parks would be part of it, to be part of our future in reality. So I'll conclude with this by saying thanks for giving me this opportunity to present in front of you. There's so much more to go on in terms of the background to this, but we're united. And I would say under COVID-19, in the way that we build communities, national urban parks, not only just in Windsor, but across this country and obviously in the province of Ontario, are significant to bind people together to know that we can do and achieve projects. So with that, I want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate the time you give me here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian, for your passionate remarks, as always. Yes, the National Urban Parks did get a big mention in the speech from the throne. But really, I think part of that that credit goes to you, Brian, for your outstanding advocacy, which I think is widely recognized, certainly by everyone today, and even more broadly. And I know, just to echo your comments about COVID, the silver lining of this, a very unfortunate time. We've seen it at the Trans-Canada Trail, where our trail use is up 50% across Canada as people are seeking opportunities to access nature. And again, I think that's what our conversation today is all about. So thank you very, very much, Brian. I wanted, before I introduce our next speaker, just circle back with a couple of housekeeping items for everyone that's listening, to let you know that you can ask questions in the Q&A box, and we're watching what comes in. Those will be shared with presenters at the end of the session. And any that we don't get to today will be answered in follow-up materials post-event. So that was a little piece of housekeeping that I wanted to share with you. I'm now delighted to present our next speaker, also from the City of Windsor, and City Councillor and Vice Chair of the Windsor City Council and Essex Region Conservation Authority, or ERCA. I know that Kieran McKenzie is a tremendous advocate for all of these issues and is going to speak to us today about the Ojibway Prairie Complex in Windsor, Essex. So Kieran, I turn the floor over to you, and thank you in advance for your presentation.
Eleanor, thank you so much, and to all of the organizers of the People's Summit for this really incredible opportunity to speak about the Ojibway Prairie Complex and the opportunity, as Brian mentioned, that we have in front of us for an urban national park. Before I get into my remarks, I also want to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibway peoples. Having said that, Brian really did a wonderful job unpacking what the opportunity that's in front of us, and I think really sort of dug down into why it's important for us to really protect these properties. He did some of his remarks dealt with who actually currently has stewardship over some of these properties that currently form the complex, and it's interesting that it's referred to as the complex because even that part of it, the stewardship of the separate properties that they are now, is a complicated mix. As Brian mentioned, the yellow property that you see on the map is currently under the stewardship of the Windsor Port Authority and the federal government. The City of Windsor, and this is where I want to focus my comments. I shouldn't say own. I said exercises stewardship over 3 of those properties. And the reason I'm such a staunch and continue to be a staunch advocate for the urban national park concept is I've come to, as a municipal councillor now, and still sort of I'm still a rookie, I guess is the best way to say it. I recognize the challenges that we have as a municipality to be able to properly exercise that stewardship over those properties. Now, those are protected areas. There's no immediate, although Brian did talk about the threat that did exist with the Ojibway shores, but there's no immediate threat with respect to the development of any of the properties that are under the stewardship of the City of Windsor. And Brian did also mention the Spring Garden Nancy, which was at one point slated for development, and thanks to the Council of the Day, they did manage to protect that property, but it wasn't without a significant effort from the community as well as from the city and the Council of the Day. And in fact, our current council is still dealing with the legal ramifications of that process. The city's taken on a very significant legal battle in order to continue to be able to protect that property, which has now come to very close to its conclusion. The point being, there are those challenges, those constant challenges that municipalities face. And this is really what I want to dig down on. The city of municipalities across Ontario have tremendous challenges with respect from a revenue generation standpoint. I think that there's no secret on that front. But we are very limited with respect to the opportunities that we have to actually generate revenue. It's all tied to land use, or at least I would say good 85% of it. We do collect some other revenues for user fees, but primarily the funding for municipalities to deliver the services, the key services and the critical services that we're expected to deliver to the communities that we serve come from, frankly, development. And when we have these 3 properties that are critical from an environmental and protection standpoint, I think there's an element of risk. And I want to stress that I'm not suggesting that there's immediate risk, but councils change. Governments at senior levels change in terms of particularly at the provincial level. And you could have, I could envision a situation where the temptation to do something different than what is currently happening on some of those properties, even if it's chunks or little pieces here and there, that different councils and different governments might choose to make different decisions. And that's why I think it's critical that we make that we look at this urban national park concept to essentially ensure in perpetuity that the Ojibway Prairie Complex remains what it is as we see it here today, as it's displayed on the map, but even has the opportunity to further expand and to protect other areas that are ecologically significant in the surrounding area that we can add to the complex. When we think about the different services and the funding envelope that we have available for the City of Windsor to be able to do what is necessary to properly protect those properties, that's less than 10% of our municipal budget. And it's not, if you actually even look at habitat protection, or you look for habitat protection as a budget line item in the budget documents that we receive when we go through that process, it doesn't exist. It's a component in the pie chart, frankly, of our parks and recreation budget, which is less than 10% of the total budget for the City of Windsor. So when you think about the municipalities, and I think that that's a similar situation that many other municipalities face in terms of the opportunities that they have to protect habitat. They have the competing pressures of land use development as their primary source of revenue, and they have very limited funds in order to be able to make the appropriate investments in order to protect the habitat that they currently are protecting. They have the development pressure all the time. Now, having said all of that, there's also the and I think that conservation authorities as well face the same types of pressures. There's certain service delivery expectations that they need to meet with respect to planning and development as well. And certainly with some of the reforms that we've seen in the Conservation Authorities Act, there's even further challenges that conservation authorities have with respect to being able to deliver on that habitat protection piece that does fall within their mandate, but is in some respects now a gray area in terms of where the funding is going to come from in order to be able to fulfill that mandate moving forward and the expectations that we all have in terms of habitat protection. So I'm going to leave you just with that, this opportunity and the concept of the urban national park. Or maybe one last point that I'll make before I sort of sign off here. The good news is the City of Windsor finally just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, at our recent council meeting, endorsed for the first time the concept of the urban national park. And so now I think it's fair to say as a region, at all levels of government, we have consensus around what we would like to see happen with the Ojibway Prairie Complex, and that's for the urban national park concept to become a reality. That's just recently been expressed by City Council, and of course, Brian and many other elected officials at senior levels of government have been supporting that in the region for many years now. So we have an opportunity to consolidate these properties, to turn it into something that's magnificent there, and hopefully someday, the next time we have a survey in terms of places that we would like to see or people would want to visit in Ontario, that the Ojibway Urban National Park makes it onto that list, or maybe even tops that list, because I think that that's the potential that it does have. So with that, again, I just want to thank the organizers, Eleanor and Brian, and all of you who are here today watching and attending this conference for your interest and your advocacy and all of the issues that you've been working on across this country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kieran, so much for that. And together with Brian and our next speaker, which is going to come to us in a moment via video, this is a continuum of presentations on the Ojibway National Urban Park concept and the complex. I know, having grown up in Windsor, and Ojibway Park was an annual field trip when I was at school, that the rich biodiversity that exists in Ojibway Park is so critical to our quality of life and the maintenance of life in general in the Windsor-Detroit area, as Brian and you have eloquently described, Kieran. So I want to thank the two of you too for working closely together. I had the privilege of being elected myself, as you may know, serving in the provincial government, and in that context worked on the conservation under government. So everything that you said resonated with me very strongly, specifically related to as well to some challenges facing municipalities. Thank you very much. And I now have the privilege of introducing our next speaker. I understand that we're having a video presentation now. Kelly Antaya and Jonathan Choquette. Kelly is the lead field technician at Wildlife Preservation Canada, and Jonathan is the lead biologist on the Ojibway Prairie Reptile Recovery Program. Both of them from Wildlife Preservation Canada, to talk about the Ojibway Prairie Complex as a new key area for biodiversity in Canada, and also to speak about, I think, perhaps that's our next speaker. Yes, that's our next speaker. Sorry, everyone. So again, presentation now by Kelly and Jonathan, and I very much look forward, as I know you do too, to hearing their presentation. So without further ado.
Hi everyone, my name is Kelly Antaya and I'm the lead field technician on the Ojibway Prairie Reptile Recovery Program at Wildlife Preservation Canada. Our program is based out of Windsor in LaSalle, Ontario, within an area of closely situated nature parks known as the Ojibway Prairie Complex and Greater Park Ecosystem, which is quite a mouthful, so hereon I'll be referring to it simply as the Ojibway Prairie. I'll be talking to you today about the site and our current work on nominating the Ojibway Prairie as a key biodiversity area. I'd like to start by providing a brief overview on key biodiversity areas, or KBAs. What are they and what do they do? Simply put, KBAs are areas of our planet that are critical for sustaining biodiversity. These areas are identified using standards set by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and for a site to qualify, it must fall into at least one of 6 categories: areas where biodiversity is threatened, areas where biodiversity is geographically restricted, areas with high ecological integrity, areas that are important for biological processes, and areas that are irreplaceable. Areas are assessed on these categories via trigger species, which I'll touch on later in this presentation. While recognition as a KBA does not provide any formal land protection, it does help to provide information about where vital natural systems exist and can inform decisions about natural resource management, land and water use, where development should be avoided, and where to focus strategic land acquisition for the protection of biodiversity. The Ojibway Prairie Complex and Greater Park Ecosystem is a network of natural areas within the city of Windsor and town of LaSalle, 2 municipalities which have a combined human population of roughly 250,000. As a result, a variety of anthropogenic land uses are present within the site, including residential, commercial, agricultural, and industrial. But most importantly, a number of distinct natural areas occur within the proposed Ojibway Prairie KBA boundaries, with a combined total of over 850 hectares, more than 60% of which are protected as municipal or provincial parks. In 1984, the Ojibway Prairie was identified as a Carolinian Canada signature site in recognition of its regional importance as a critical natural area. In 2016, it was recognized as an important amphibian and reptile area due to its nationally significant reptile diversity. We'd like to further recognize the Ojibway Prairie's importance by securing a KBA recognition, highlighting the significance of the site for a variety of flora and fauna at the national scale. Of the KBA categories I mentioned before, the Ojibway Prairie falls into the very first category: areas where biodiversity is threatened. In fact, it's been said that no other location in the province supports such a high concentration of rare species. This site is home to over 100 provincially rare plants, 252 bird species, 10 at-risk reptiles, and 2 CPAWS-listed mammals. These numbers aren't surprising when you think about it. Tallgrass prairie and savanna ecosystems were once widespread throughout southern Ontario, but human pressures and development have reduced these ecosystems to isolated remnants. Less than 3% of the historic range of tallgrass prairie remains in Ontario, and only a handful of sites with savanna ecosystems persist in the Carolinian zone. The Ojibway Prairie contains some of the largest remnants of tallgrass prairie and savanna ecosystems in Canada. It's a pocket of nature, nestled in a part of Ontario where natural environments of all kinds have largely been replaced by intensive agriculture or urbanization. And thus, the Ojibway Prairie serves as a last haven for many rare native species. Unfortunately, ongoing threats, such as residential development, habitat fragmentation, road mortality, and invasive species remain, highlighting the need for increased recognition, protection, and threat mitigation. The loss or degradation of natural habitats within the proposed KBA site could result in significant declines in the Canadian populations of some species. Our KBA nomination focuses on 11 at-risk trigger species, 3 snakes, and 8 plants. These species were carefully selected based on their restricted ranges in Canada, their conservation statuses, and the estimated number of mature individuals found at our site. Each species must pass thresholds at our site to qualify as a trigger species, including a minimum number of reproductive units and a minimum percentage of the national population. Our species include the eastern fox snake, the largest snake at our site. They are constrictors that prey on rodents and birds. We estimate that the Ojibway Prairie contains roughly 3% of the Carolinian population. Butler's garter snakes are an earthworm specialist, lover of grassy fields, and one of Canada's prettiest garter snakes. We believe the Ojibway Prairie is home to at least 10% of Butler's garter snakes in Canada. The eastern Massasauga is Ontario's only venomous snake. They're quite shy and hard to come by and can be found at only one other location in the Carolinian zone. We estimate this site may house approximately 10% of Carolinian Massasaugas. Dense blazing star is a tall flowering plant found in southwestern Ontario. It's a valuable plant for pollinators, including butterflies, bees, beetles, and hummingbirds. We estimate that the Ojibway Prairie contains approximately 16% of the Canadian population. Here we have pink milkwort and pale purple false foxglove, two more of the many rare plants found at our site. The Ojibway Prairie contains approximately 20% of the populations for both of these plants in Canada. Willow-leafed aster is a locally abundant plant at our site, which is very rare in Canada. While its seeds have a low germination rate, it spreads successfully through rhizomes. We estimate 48% of the Canadian population is contained within the boundaries of our site. Purple twayblade is a small orchid which thrives in prairie, savanna, and other open habitat types. There are approximately 3,300 plants in Canada in any given year. A 2015 survey found 2,110 of these plants in one distinct park at our site, indicating that at least 64% of Canada's purple twayblade orchids are found at the Ojibway Prairie. Prairie rose is a climbing vine-like plant found in open Carolinian habitats. The encroachment of invasives like multiflora rose and autumn olive pose a threat to this species of special concern. Coincidentally, the city of Windsor is also known as the City of Roses. Up to 80% of prairie rose's known area of occupancy in Canada is within the boundaries of the Ojibway Prairie. White-tubed colic root is abundant at our site, with large patches in some areas and a total population of over 6,000 plants estimated in 2015. Seeds of this endangered species were artificially germinated for the first time as part of the habitat restoration works for the Herb Grey Parkway. Excluding these planted individuals, the Ojibway Prairie contains approximately 88% of Canada's white-tubed colic root. Finally, slender bush clover is our one trigger species which can't be found anywhere else in Canada. 100% of this species range occurs at the Ojibway Prairie and is primarily restricted to the less disturbed prairie remnants within our site. In addition to these 11 trigger species, the Ojibway Prairie is home to a wealth of plant and invertebrate species found nowhere else in Canada. During a 2014 and 2015 BioBlitz, 16 invertebrates were found that had never before been recorded in Canada, and one species which had previously been declared extirpated. Another invertebrate species, Loxoscera ojibwayensis, is globally endemic to the Ojibway Prairie. At least 4 other plant species are found here which occur nowhere else in Canada. With ongoing surveys, we expect that there are even more discoveries to come, and this highlights the importance of the Ojibway Prairie. The Ojibway Prairie Complex and Greater Park ecosystem is truly a unique area which has managed to survive despite ongoing urban expansion. The future of this site is by no means certain, and the development pressures continue. For example, in the Windsor-Essex region, we estimated that 13 species of reptiles and amphibians that occurred here historically have already become extirpated from the region. It's up to us to ensure that this area remains protected into the future. If you want to learn more about KBAs, you can visit kbacanada.org or keybiodiversityareas.org. If you'd like to learn more about Wildlife Preservation Canada and the Ojibway Prairie Reptile Recovery Program, visit wildlifepreservation.ca/Ojibway Prairie Reptile Recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Jonathan, I don't know if you're going to share any comments or not, or if that's the essence of the presentation.
Nope, that's everything for now. Thank you.
Okay, that would have been a hard act to follow in any case, right? That was a tremendous presentation. And I have to admit a strong affection for garter snakes. So I really enjoyed that in a special way. So thank you very much indeed. I'm learning a tremendous amount by all of these presentations, and I have no doubt that our next speaker will add to that rich knowledge base. Our next presenter is Tom Woodcock. Tom is from the Rare Charitable Research Reserve, which I believe is based in Cambridge, Ontario. And the reserve is an urban land trust and environmental institute in Waterloo Region in Wellington in terms of protection, and their key focus is on protecting highly sensitive lands. So I'm looking forward to hearing you, Tom, as I know we all are. I welcome you, and I turn over the podium to you. Thank you.
Hi, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm more or less coming from the opposite end of the Carolinian zone. We're right at the northern edge in the region of Waterloo, located in the city of Cambridge is our main office, but we're spread across Waterloo, Wellington with some of the properties that we steward. Next slide, please. Rare has a mission of protecting land through conservation, but we also wish to encourage scientific research on our properties. So we have professional research staff who engage university researchers, and we've had more than 100 projects either completed or ongoing on the project. And we also have an educational aspect, engaging the community through education, schools and camps. We have two full-time educators on staff who admittedly during COVID have had to find some other things to do with all the schools closed down for trips, as well as passive recreation. Next slide, please. Our main property is located on the edge of the city of Cambridge, the village of Blair. So this is our property. You can see all the urban area surrounding us, and actually it's increasing. The large open agricultural area you can see in the bottom right corner is actually being filled with houses as we speak, about 2,300 of them. So we're going to be getting a whole bunch of new neighbors in the not too distant future. You can see our trail network there in pink. Next slide, please. Being in an urban area, we have a number of challenges, which I'm sure is familiar to people across the Carolinian zone. Properties tend to be very small. The landscape is fragmented amongst a variety of uses. It's largely in private ownership, and it's very, very expensive. And these characteristics together make it difficult to build habitat patches of ecologically meaningful size and connecting those patches across the landscape. In the Waterloo Wellington area, which has a total of nearly 1 million people, if we haven't passed that threshold already, most of the land is either developed in one way or another, or it is in agriculture. And most of the connectivity on the landscape revolves around the river valleys. We do have challenges with the high human population as well, with property damage and misuse, and a predominance of recreation goals. Of course, passive recreation, cultural practices, and so forth are compatible with conservation, but we also have, when we open a property to those activities, we also have off-trail use, fires, parties, dumping and litter, dirt bikes and ATVs, and endless off-leash dogs. Next slide, please. So Rare's original property that I showed there in the village of Blair was founded in 2001. We're coming up on our 20th anniversary and have a unfortunately virtual celebration scheduled for it. But in recent years, we've started to look beyond the borders to secure and steward additional properties in Waterloo, Wellington. Some will have public access, some are prioritized as conservation land. So we began to develop this land securement strategy in order to make the best use of the resources that we had. Next slide, please. So looking at the development of this land securement strategy, you can see the orange outline of the Blair property that I showed earlier there. We determined what would be desirable characteristics of land to secure in this area. So wetland, woodland, floodplain, and existing secured land were chosen as the categories that we wanted to work with. Next slide, please. We wanted to merge all of these together to avoid double counting. And we ended up not being able to account for agriculture or open space habitat, which was something we're looking to include in our next model. There isn't a lot of open space habitat in the area that is not in agriculture, although there are some things like a few old abandoned hay fields or restored prairie areas, including on our own property. Next slide, please. So in each of the parcels in Waterloo, oh, that's okay, you don't have to go back. In Waterloo, Wellington, over 2 hectares, which was the threshold we chose, we determined the percentage of this desirable conservation land within the parcel. And then we also determined the conservation land that was available in the neighborhood. And with some experimenting, we settled on a 500-meter radius of the centroid of each parcel. If we got it smaller than that, then it tended to include mostly the land that was just in the parcel. And if we got any larger than that, then it tended to not count very well because it was spilling over into surrounding areas anyway. So realizing that there's going to be some level of autocorrelation with parcel size, we settled on 500 meters. Next slide, please. And then use that to calculate a score. So adding the conservation land within the parcel and within the 500-meter buffer together, multiplied it by the logarithm of the parcel area in meters squared, gave us a score. And this is a plot of the count, frequency count of parcels in those different score categories. And we got the distribution that we were looking for, with most of the parcels being very scored very low, and then high discriminatory power at the upper tail where the very highest quality parcels were found. Next slide, please. After some ground truthing, which eliminated some large parcels that showed up, like golf courses, for example, which show up as large green spaces in this analysis, we managed to find focal areas where there was a number of quality parcels close together, and we looked to get at least one focal area within each of the lower tier municipalities in Waterloo, Wellington. So having done that, we then used those to focus our activities. And as of now, we've acquired property in 3 of these focal areas, either through purchase or through donation under the Eco-Gifts program. And we're working on one in a 4th, although that's a large eco-gift that has some significant planning challenges that need to be overcome with the municipalities before we can proceed with that. Next slide, please. So our first ecological gift was donated to us by the Reiners. It's just basically a rectangle of forested wetland, which is lovely. Next slide, please. It's about 5% of a larger feature called the Roseville Swamp. It's largely been saved by the fact that it's extremely difficult to move through. So people have just more or less ignored it. If you look closely underneath the ferns, you can see a lot of the sucking mud that you have to slog through if you're moving through this property. Next slide, please. In the vicinity of our Blair property, which is at the northern edge there, the green outline, we've also got several ecological gifts which we're working on, which are shown in the darker blue. We have a restrictive covenant on development and also to allow research in the central area there. And then we have a small eco gift as well that's already gone through the small green parcel at the bottom. So these features are the Gillam Marsh and Barry's Lake, which are fairly well known in the area. Next slide, please. The Gillam Marsh is a bit of a misnomer because it's a number of kettle lakes and marshy areas embedded in forested uplands. Next slide, please. So it's quite a diverse habitat. Next slide, please. And then Barry's Lake, where we have the easement, is one of the largest areas of open water located in the region of Waterloo. Next slide, please. And then finally, the Aramosa corridor, which is upstream of Guelph on the Aramosa River. We have acquired 3 properties there, and we're working on some other easements and one further donation as well. Next slide, please. Property 1 is an area of agricultural land and forest, including the Aramosa River Valley ANSI and part of it. Next slide, please. Just a smaller portion of the Aramosa River. Next slide, please. We've recently been given gifted through the Eco Gift program a former camp called Edgewood, which has some trails on it and is on Blue Springs Creek, which is a tributary of the Aramosa. Next slide, please. And next slide again, please. This would have been easier with my own clicker. Property 2 is another purchase that we made, which is even further downstream. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that there's the river's considerably larger here. And then the next slide will show you the Mill Pond lands, which is the next eco gift that we're working on. This is actually upstream of where the Aramosa River splits and goes into the historic mill pond at Eden Mills. And next slide, please. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Tom. That's an exciting overview of all of your progress and all of the work that you're doing in terms of land preservation and gifts. So that what you shared with us today is exciting and really, really interesting. And I can only imagine the amount of advocacy and hard work that's gone into securing those donations and those gifts. So congratulations to you and your team. That's a really amazing piece of work and advocacy on your part. So way to go. Okay. Thank you, Tom. Our next presenter, Emily Williamson, is from the City of London, where she's an ecologist. And as everybody on this call knows, the City of London is the forest city. So how appropriate, Emily, that you would share with us the conversation that you're having with and Carolinian Forest. So over to you, Emily Williamson. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. As Kieran and Brian did, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territory on which I sit is the Adawandran, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape peoples, and we honor their contributions to past and future generations and the environmental areas within London. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Emily Williamson, and I'm a planning ecologist with the City of London. I'm happy to join you this afternoon to discuss the recent incorporation of London's environmentally significant areas into Canada's Target 1 database. This work was completed in the winter of 2020, and we are pleased to share it in the hopes that other municipalities will include their protected areas into the database and screen new areas for protection. Next slide, please. So what is an environmentally significant area, or an ESA? These areas are identified on map 5 of the London Plan, categorized separately from other open space types, such as parks. ESA boundaries are based on the vegetated limits of natural heritage features and exist on both private and public lands. About 1,870 hectares exist across the city, and of these areas, 815 are publicly owned and managed by the city's contract with Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, UTRCA. Every year we acquire more lands and new areas are designated as ESAs. ESAs are essentially the national parks of London, and these areas consist of rare, sensitive, or unique ecological features and functions. Next slide, please. So this is map 5 of the London Plan, and on it, ESAs are outlined in pink, and you can just see a few of them. We have some larger woodlands. Most of them are associated with some kind of riverine feature that terminates into the Thames. ESAs can consist of any number of natural heritage features, again, such as wetlands, woodlands, or valley lands, all which receive municipal protection, policy protection, in addition to the provincial protections that are in place. Next slide, please. So as a city ecologist, I help manage the 12 city-owned ESAs, and these areas consist of about 735 hectares of high-quality habitat managed to enhance their ecological integrity. As mentioned, these areas consist of forests, wetlands, meadows, and they support a diversity of SAR and native species. This map illustrates where these public ESAs are located, and there's actually 12, not 11 here, so we've actually added a new one since this mapping, so we'll have to update that. And as new ESAs are added to the map, associated brochures are made up to outline the trails and amenities that that area contains, if any. And all of these brochures are available on the city's website if you're interested in taking a look. Next slide, please. ESAs are preserved, restored, and managed for their ecological resilience. Some examples of this include the work for Fauteaux anemone management and the ecological restoration of Westminster Ponds ESA. With respect to the Fauteaux anemone population, London is home to one of 6 remnant communities in the country. Invasive goutweed has been successfully managed around one of these populations in the Medway Valley and has resulted in a population increase of over 350% in the last 6 years. The city has been included in the federal recovery strategy for this threatened flower based on these successful management strategies. Another example of the restoration enhancement work that we complete is that of Westminster Ponds. A 4-hectare area that consisted largely of buckthorn, dead ash trees, and other non-native and invasive plants was restored in 2016 with the help of the Canada 150 federal grant program. Native species are now dominant in this area. Next slide, please. So what is the pathway to Canada's Target 1? The federal government has committed to conserving 25% of Canada's land and 25% of its oceans by 2025. In August of 2019, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change announced funding for a series of challenge projects, including the establishment of up to 27 Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Projects that identify new areas for conservation can apply for funding through the Canada Nature Fund, and areas with existing protected natural areas can apply for inclusion in the database. More information about this program and the database can be found on the canada.ca website. Next slide, please. As part of the continued efforts to preserve and protect London's ESAs, the city partnered with UTRCA to assess city and UTRCA-owned ESA lands, looking at existing policies and practices. These ESAs are governed by the same policies under the London Plan and include site-specific conservation master plans. Although these habitats can vary greatly based on the similarities, from a policy perspective, the ESAs were accepted in a batch that was assessed together. The ESAs are now formally recognized in the Pathway to Canada Target 1 database as protected areas. This is the first time that municipally protected areas have been included in Ontario. Inclusion in this database recognizes the existing ESA protection status at the same level as national and provincial parks. Next slide, please. There are 9 criteria that are used to assess areas that may contribute to Target 1 goals. In the case of London's ESAs, 1, geographic space. Are the borders well defined? Yes, ESAs have defined borders established through planning policy processes that are mapped into policy. 2, do we have the tools we need to protect these spaces? Again, yes. Multiple provincial and municipal policies and bylaws prohibit activities that are incompatible with the conservation biodiversity. 3, are the tools being used to prevent incompatible activities? Again, yes. Multiple provincial and municipal policies and bylaws are enforced by city bylaw staff and the UCRCA ESA team to prohibit activities that are incompatible with conservation biodiversity. 4, long-term. How long is the space intended to be around? These lands are managed and protected in perpetuity through public ownership and the federal, provincial, and municipal policies. The likelihood of an official plan designation and the other protections afforded to ESAs being undone or modified is very low, resulting in moderate to high difficulty for reversal. Rezoning would require city council vote, public consultation, and that could possibly still be appealed, which is great news for the ESAs. 5, timing. Are protections year-round? Again, the answer is yes in this case. Scope of objectives. What is the focus or result of the objectives? The focus and goal is to protect and preserve these areas. This is accomplished through annual capital projects and operational activities that are city funded through the city funded contract with UTRCA. Invasive species management, native plantings, enforcement, trail management maintenance, garbage pickup, and community education programs and initiatives are all included as part of this work. 7, primacy of objectives. Who wins when there's a conflict? Given the protections in place and the mandate to preserve these areas for the long term, the ESAs win when there are conflicting objectives. Governing authorities. Who is in charge of what? The ESAs are owned by the City of London and UTRCA. The City of London funds a contract with UTRCA to manage these areas to achieve aligned conservation goals. And finally, 9, biodiversity conservation outcomes. Effective biodiversity conservation is achieved within the ESA properties through protection, trail management, invasive species management, and ecological restoration activities. Whew, that was a lot. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I've included the Target 1, Table 1. And as mentioned, London's ESAs were evaluated, and they were evaluated actually the A level for protected areas, or PA, based on the existing protections that we have in place. Here we see the first 5 criteria: geographical space, effective means 1 and 2, long-term protection, and timing. Next slide, please. Again, Table 2 assesses the ESAs for governing authorities and biodiversity outcomes, again at the A level for protected areas. Next slide, please. And finally, the primacy of objectives and scope of objectives, also found in Table 2, meeting the A level for protected areas. Next slide, please. So in summary, London's ESAs have existing policy protection, active management, and sufficient biodiversity such that they were accepted into the Target 1 database. These areas now count toward meeting provincial land conservation targets and will continue to be managed and preserved for the long term. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Emily. That was comprehensive and really, really interesting, and a real model for other municipalities to follow. And when I'm looking at the rich variety of data and progress that you've made, I'm reminded of a nonprofit uses often: R&D, rip off and duplicate. Other municipalities should be engaging in some R&D when looking at the City of London and to the City of London for inspiration. So thank you very much. We've actually reached our final speaker, and then I'll come back to you before I hand it over to another colleague who's going to manage the Q&A session, which I'm also looking forward to. But our final speaker is Brad Fauteaux, and I'm sure that Brad is well known to all of you. His detailed bio, as are the detailed bio available on the website. Brad is going to talk to us today about Rondeau Provincial Park and the Leases issue, which has been an issue that's perseverated for quite some time now, and one I know that's very much top interest to all of us. So Brad, we look forward to your presentation, and I hand it over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Eleanor. First, I'll acknowledge that I'm here in Toronto. I'm on the traditional territory of a number of nations, Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And of course, Toronto is now home to every diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is treaty territory, which is Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I honor those nations, and I pay respect to their elders past and present, and to their children who are the elders of the future to come. I also want to say hi to Marilyn Capriel, who's on the call. And Marilyn and I met many, many years ago in Shawanaga when I worked for Ontario Parks, and I'm happy to see her again after all these years. I wanted to talk to you about Rondeau Provincial Park, which is maybe the most important biodiversity hotspot in Southern Ontario, not to compete with my friends from Windsor here, and one that is really in peril and under threat. So next slide, please. And so a quick agenda, I'll talk about mostly the last three issues. Rondeau in terms of where it is and what it is. We've got a beautiful Pronotheritea warbler there, one of the many migratory birds that stops on its way to other places in Rondeau. So next slide. I like this map because it's the map from the park management plan that was established when I was in high school. And so certainly it's probably time to have a new park management plan for such an important place, but you'll see Rondeau located there right on the shores of Lake Erie. It's a large, small cuspid span spit there that represents Rondeau a little bit up from Point Pelee. Next slide. Again, another ancient map from the Rondeau Park Management Plan. And now I'm actively teasing my former Ontario Parks colleagues to update the plan. And so you'll see that striped area on the right is where most of the cottages are along the shore of Lake Erie in the sensitive dune ecosystem. And then you'll see a little bit there, a small section at the top. Next slide. And so a little bit of knowledge about Rondeau. It's the second oldest park in the system. It's actually the oldest. Algonquin claims to be the oldest, but it was established first as a national park. Rondeau is classified as a natural environment park, and so under the PPCRA, the provincial legislation, obviously protected for its natural gifts. The park management plan is from 1991, so it is certainly overdue and has been amended a couple of times, one for a deer call and one for an extension on cottages that we'll talk about. Next slide. I've often maintained tongue-in-cheek that it's Ontario's Galapagos. It's a remarkable diversity of exceptional habitat. And so you have dune, tallgrass prairie, and savanna ecosystems, which our friends on the call here have talked about earlier in respect of the Windsor area. It has a provincially significant wetland and one of the largest, if not the largest remaining tract of deciduous forests in Carolinian Canada that remains. On its own, as a geographic landform, Rondeau might be the most significant and important example of a cuspid sandspit on the face of the earth. And so something else really important. It's habitat for over 80 species of risk, and it's the highest rate of species at risk of any provincial park in Ontario. There's a large list of them there, and I've been equitable with birds and amphibians and all the rest. All the way down. I would note Nodding Pogonia, it's only one of 2 locations in the entire country for this endangered wildflower as an example. And again, over 300 nationally, provincially, or locally significant plant species, 1,700 insect species, many found in very few places. And so, I have often said that it may be the most significant biodiversity hotspot in the province. Next slide. And so the concern I bring to you today is a longstanding concern. Rondeau Provincial Park has 282 private cottage lots that are located within the park, and 2/3 of those are in the nationally rare freshwater dune ecosystem on the eastern shore of Lake Erie. And so the cottagers and the cottages themselves have been in the park for about 100 years, and so it's a long history of being in the park. But I provided you an example here of obviously a brick 2-level, thousands of square foot cottage that is an example of one of many cottages in the park. And the concern, of course, is that these are permanent structures and the impacts that those permanent structures have. And many of them, of course, are being lived in year round, which means they're actually homes. They're very much not cottages. And so the cottages are, I would postulate, in contravention of the Act by existing, by failing to maintain septic systems. There have been concerns about vegetation removal. And of course, sensitive vegetation is one of the really important aspects of this park in terms of its natural designation. There have been numerous instances where people have been lawn mowing sensitive savanna and dune ecosystems, and or digging them up and replanting them with non-native grass or other awesome plants like Japanese barberry and some other landscape plants we know have real significant impacts. There's a lot of creation of footpaths through these sensitive ecosystems, which of course gets in the way of any number of species having their ecosystems intact. Roads and driveway mortality is significant for amphibian and mammal communities. The introduction of invasive species is also significant, particularly on a flora perspective. And then, of course, there are domestic pets, dogs and cats. And cats, of course, are the largest killers of songbirds in North America, and certainly a really significant problem in a place like Rondeau, where, you know, other than Point Pelee, is the most important natural bird area on the Erie shore. All of which causes harm to species at risk, and the primary concern, of course, as we said earlier, there's 80 species of risk in Rondeau, so in a really important hotspot. We have already documented elevated concentrations of phosphorus and nitrates in groundwater as a result of failing septic systems. There is soil contamination as a result of any number of different processes involved in having what's really a suburban environment in a natural environment park, and widespread pollution. And of course, the cottages really run contrary to the guiding principle in this law, which is that, you know, these parks are to be maintained for ecological integrity and to remain unimpaired for future generations. Next slide. And so I bring this to you today because there have been recent developments that are really concerning. And so the leases were given an extension. And the language of the extension is really particular, and I'll draw you to the second bullet point there that says to initiate the development of a new proposal for the long-term occupation of the cottage lots. And so that's about as clear a direction as I've ever seen in government policy around not taking the cottages out, which has been the longstanding policy since 1954, although it has been kicked down the road a little bit by a succession of governments. And so you notice that language, it really provides direction to the ministry to pursue ways to keep these cottages in the park forever. And that, of course, is not going to at all achieve the ecological integrity outcomes that we want for Rondeau Provincial Park. There's also work happening at the municipal level. And recently there was a resolution of Chatham-Kent's Council, which proposed to work with the province on actually selling the land in the park to the municipality to be then further sold to the cottagers, which is extraordinary in my 20 plus years of public service. And so, they've identified an appraised land value there, and there's an indication of an exchange that might augment a provincial park locally. But the main concern is that they're really contemplating selling the land from this provincial park, which is an enormous policy deviation from the fact that these cottages were slated to be removed from the park over the last 50 some years. And so and the picture that you see there, of course, is the real prime real estate. This is the Lake Erie side that shows you the beautiful beach and sensitive dune ecosystem, and the park, the cottages would be just to your right, about 15 yards. And so we are talking about a very desirable place, perhaps from a cottage and a tourism perspective, but nonetheless, ecological integrity is not maintained with having permanent structures in parks. And the next slide. And that's it. And so thanks for listening. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Of course, I was the managing director of Ontario Parks at one point, and this was an ongoing issue, and I expect it to be an ongoing issue for a while. So appreciate your support.
Thank you very much for a compelling presentation and extremely informative. I know I've been well aware of the cottage lease issue for a really profound and detailed look. So thank you very, very much for being with us today and for your remarks. And I now have the privilege of turning over the mic to Liz Hendricks, who's the Vice President of Restoration and Regeneration at World Wildlife Fund of Canada. And Liz is going to take the mic from here on in. And if you need any assistance, Liz, and I don't suspect that you will, I'm here as backup for you. But Liz is going to really manage the question and answer session for our presenters and navigate the to and fro. So thank you, Liz. And I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much. And that was incredible. I feel like you're going to be a hook trying to get me off the screen because, wow, some amazing questions coming and really great presentations. Thanks. And a thought that leads into a question, I promise. You know, I heard a lot about claiming the first of or we're the only of, and it really entrenches this idea of scarcity mindset. And I think listening to these presentations, I'm reminded of the certainty that we have this rich diversity, and it's humbling to live with. And I think we are so lucky, I think, in Ontario to have this diversity and richness. And so really amazing. So thank you so much for really nailing the biodiversity we do have in this province. A question, it was going to start with Councillor McCohen, but I think actually Emily as well, and a bit Brad in your presentation. Can you speak to, there's a bit of a perverse incentive for municipalities around protection because of, you know, Councillor, you mentioned this land base and financing. And can you speak to maybe what are those barriers? And if you can imagine a world where there is an incentive to protect, for municipalities to protect land and it not be a financial deficit to do that. And maybe Emily, you have some of those barriers as well in the work you're doing.
Liz, thanks for that question. It's a really good question, and I frankly, I'm gonna say I actually don't have a good answer for you, other than I think some of the answers are already out there. We do need to recognize that there are financial returns for municipalities when they protect habitat, and Ojibway it already does provide those. We do see it is a desirable area in and around the protected areas, as we heard in the presentation from Marilyn, that there is development that's happening around that. Ojibway in and of itself, the protected areas that we have in our area or in our region are tourism destinations, which certainly contribute to the local economy in many different ways. And not to mention, when you do have protected habitat, and this is something that we learn through our investment attraction process and economic development, when we have spaces that are protected that people can use, where the wildlife is still protected, but also people have the opportunity to enjoy it. These are the types of communities where companies are looking to invest. So I think that those are parts of the argument that need to be brought more strongly to the table when folks like myself and other decision makers at the municipal level are thinking about whether or not they would want to look at a potential parcel as being protected or not, or slated for some form of development, and to continue to exercise those protections when we do have them in place. That they are economic drivers in and of themselves, as well as helping us to meet all of those climate change objectives that we're attempting to meet. So how we change the model in terms of revenue, I don't know what other things that we could tax to generate those revenues, which is why I'm very strongly advocating for us to upload those particular properties to ensure that they get the proper investment and protection that they need to have moving forward. I don't know if this is the best answer to your question.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you. Yeah, Emily, go ahead.
Sure, and I think a little bit of a roundabout answer to your question. The city employs several ecologists, so we are mandated through policy to conserve lands, whether it's the ESAs or the other natural features within the city. We have access to a large fund called the Woodland Acquisition Fund. So when development approvals and applications come through, development boundaries and the limits of development are established, and any land that is not developable, typically we would move forward to acquire as part of the public lands through other development pieces as well. there are the proximity to existing ESAs and natural features is included as part of the development charges process, such that the value is already understood by the development community, that people want to live here because of the proximity to some of these natural spaces, and they are able to charge a premium for some of these properties as a result. There's some of the new pieces that are coming in. It's not preserving land, but the city is moving forward with a complete corridors model such that we're able to stack various infrastructure within a parcel. So stormwater management, we renaturalize the area and include pathways. So how can we fit all of the things we need to within an urban space, conserving what we have, but also creating along previously agricultural blocks that did not have habitat necessarily and have been farmed over the past several hundred years. How can we create new habitats that will establish linkages between our conserved spaces? So that's how we're sort of trying to do it that way.
Beautiful. We'll get back to your corridor comment. That's a good one. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, and I think I'm excited for the first municipality in Canada that adds ecosystem service benefit to their accounting line item and puts it squarely within capital and says that green infrastructure producing ecosystem service benefit. You know, we talk about clean air and clean water, but the reality is of flood mitigation, drought mitigation, and climate change resilience are all going to be within there. And so whether it's a tax and levy structure, whether it's other public policy levers with business or people, I feel like there has to be a way for our public accounting to take into account the reams of study that proves ecosystem service benefit is real and can be managed at all scales, locally, provincially, nationally, globally. And so I'm excited for whichever municipality it is to consider it a challenge to put out their public budget papers in a given year and have a line item for ecosystem service benefit and have it attached to a tax or policy structure or a tax or policy lever. I think that would be incredibly exciting. It doesn't have to be a lot of money to start, but it's really there to show a cost benefit analysis in terms of how it's going to benefit those people around you. Agriculturally, rurally, urban, there are no parts of how we live that doesn't fit. So I would look forward to that.
So would I. Talk about being the first at something. That's what we want to be the first at.
Yeah, London, you're up, right? Like,
yeah. We're all going to be watching your next budget. No pressure. Question from the audience, and I think this is really important in the era of reconciliation. Elder Capriel, really appreciate you holding this space for us. A question around, you know, we acknowledge traditional territories, we acknowledge the history of how we've come to these lands. Have you, has anyone kind of spoken or thought about land back for Indigenous nations or, you know, this idea of properties and ownership in the work they're doing? Oh, and before everyone jumps to that really easy question, just wanted to let everyone know in the audience that if we don't get to your question, we will be in the package that comes post the summit. There will be answers to your questions. There we go. Anyone?
Sure. I'll start. We've moved forward as part of our conservation master plan process to include the communities in our area. The city has also posted a new position for inclusion and then First Nations Indigenous consultation and engagement. The successful applicant for that new position was actually a member of one of the communities, so it's a great opportunity to work in collaboration with them. A lot of overlap between some of the archaeological sites and then how that relates to the natural spaces and medicine walks that can happen in that area. It's not simply an acknowledgement, it's how can we ensure that not only are we protecting natural spaces, but how are we also protecting the cultural and traditional aspects that may not be a species at risk, but are very important to the communities. We haven't looked at land back yet, though, so I'll pass that one off.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so for our area, Caldwell First Nations, Ojibway Shores is part of their traditional land. They've just reached a settlement with the federal government. I'm a New Democrat, just so we don't know the politics, but just people understand kind of where I'm coming from. And so we invited them and had them down on the site, and they were in their process of doing their own thing, but they're supporting this one in terms of how we move forward. But they chose to opt out of at that time about 5 years ago, because this goes back quite a bit. Long story short, we're trying to get this land transferred from the Port Authority, which has been done before. I was on City Council at the time when we had to buy Peche Island, which was a provincial park, from the provincial government for $1.3 million. And then we had to crush a woodlot on the shoreline to pay for it because we didn't have the votes to actually keep the woodlot and buy the island and not have it developed, because it's actually had houses on it before. And thank goodness we did that. So there needs to be a larger country discussion about this issue as well too. So we've kind of tried to approach it that way, and we're going to kind of just continue as we can try to get this land transferred and protected, be in touch with them and see how we proceed. But everything's on the table because it's an important part of who we are and where we need to go. And I think that obviously land is still very much one of those discussion pieces that needs a larger, more in-depth conversation from everybody, because that's tied to justice.
Absolutely. Thank you. Go ahead, Tom.
Couldn't unmute there for a second, I don't know. So yeah, the RARE organization has, first of all, I say we steward quite a number of known archaeological sites and take that responsibility quite seriously. Generally, the stewardship is to sort of leave them in situ. But we also, the organization has made it a priority to actively engage as we can with local people as far as activities on the property. So there's been some cultural activities like art installation that was put in by a First Nations man and has since become a bit of a gathering spot. There's been some other gatherings in various places on our properties. We're looking into things like hunting, so people will be able to come and hunt deer and then return them to their community as part of a food security or food sovereignty movement. So we're looking for different ways that we can engage different people in activities that that they want to do and that they feel are important on our properties.
Great. I'm going to try and squeeze in for sure one question, maybe two more questions. Back to the corridors. So Emma, you were talking about London's working towards planning around corridors in a various way. And I guess this question was also aimed for Tom. Can you speak to how you overlay your forecasting of the properties you're seeking out? And do you overlay it with, climate change projections or development planning in Waterloo? And when we're thinking corridor, protection and planning, is that overlaid with other threats? Maybe Tom, you go ahead.
So we do have, as I mentioned, the areas that we can protect are limited, and we certainly do engage with the planning authorities. We have members of the local conservation authority and regional planning on our land securement advisory committee, together with some more academic planners, professors, a couple of retired professors from the University of Waterloo's planning program that do advise us. Climate change planning is something that we've been grappling with a fair bit because we are sort of constrained, I guess you would say, like the land that is already industrialized or residential or whatever is not, it's not going to be turned back into natural habitat. So we have to sort of work with what's there, and it's a bit of a difficult thing. So we've started thinking more about species composition and trying to think about how species can change or might be expected to change in the context of invasives, but also in the context of native species, and maybe some that need a little help. You know, like could we perhaps secure some disease-resistant American chestnuts, which used to exist on the property 120 years ago, and maybe fill in a couple spots where all the ash trees have died. You know, things like that, that we're considering both as research questions and as land management, ecosystem management questions.
And to continue along that train, with respect to we do view them as sort of three separate items, as much as they are all the same conversation. The climate piece, the protection piece, and then the complete corridors piece are three separate items in our minds, because that is protecting the spaces we have. How are we engineering appropriate habitat that can then be naturalized and be included, such that not only are we achieving no net loss, but we are eventually able to establish a net benefit. And then how are those spaces functioning for a 200-year flood event? How are we ensuring a diverse, as Tom mentioned, a diverse array of species, so that we have that diverse community that isn't going to the entire ash forest isn't going to be gone in one fell swoop. We engage in substantial invasive species management throughout the city, just trying to provide any benefit that we can to the spaces we already have, and protecting what is already protected. So we are moving forward on the climate change front. That is outside the scope of my work, unfortunately, but there's a climate change emergency action plan that's currently being undertaken at the city, and there's actually an online screening tool where members of the public can go on and assess their carbon footprint and make the decisions as if they were a city planner. So how can we actually attack this issue together? And it's the solution to the online challenge is a bit of a multi-pronged approach. So yeah, it's not an easy answer.
Yeah, no, it's not. And they weren't easy questions. I thank all of you so much for those. Great. There were further questions that we will get to. And I just want to add, for the record, and to follow up, because I can't send my own questions in, but I would love to hear, what are your biggest critics saying to you, and how do you overcome those challenges? Okay, Janet, I know you're the one with the hook. You're hooking me. Thank you.
Well, Liz, you did a fabulous job. And like you, I could. And by the way, your last question was tremendous. And it's been on my mind as too, because those shared in terms of, dealing with the naysayers and those negative Nellies or those problematic advocacy issues, and we all can really learn from that. So, but Janet does all the great work that you're talking about, and she's one who helps us to manage those on an ongoing basis. I know I learn from her all the time. So thank you, Liz, for your tremendous work today. And thank you to all our speakers. I've enjoyed this immensely. Thank you to Janet and the team for inviting me. I learned a ton. Great to see so many old friends, Brian, and really keep going on, Brian. You're doing such a great job. Let's keep our fingers and see if we can get that National Urban Park going. You have many, many friends, and including many people on the call today. So thank you, colleagues, for having me and asking me to have the privilege of moderating this session today. I learned a ton. So keep on keeping on, everybody. You're doing great work. Thank you very much. And thank you, Janet.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody. We're closing this session, and we're going to end the day with the closing prayer with our elder, Marilyn Capriel. I just want to say a personal thank to everybody who participated today, in particular Minister Karina Gould, who gave us some great remarks for the team and everybody else. And I think we heard a great deal about connectivity, but it even goes back to yesterday when we heard, I think it was Lawrence talking about the breathing, the cooling, and the birthing lands. And he was talking about the birds and how they migrate down south. And so if we don't take care of the land close to where we live, those birds won't have anywhere to travel to and then make their way back up to Mushkegowuk. So even though we are working in Windsor or Rondeau or London or elsewhere, or Kitchener, Waterloo, we're all working on the same planet and making sure that we have connectivity right around the globe. And so thank you to to each and every one of you who participated today. Thank you for attending, and we will have this all loaded up on the site. And without further ado, I want to go to Marilyn Capriel to do the closing prayer, and make sure you join us tomorrow morning at 8:45. Thank you. Marilyn, take it away.
Oh, well, all of the visiting was going on, the sharing of knowledge. My husband and I have a great visitor to take care of. Somebody else has moved in with us. Yesterday, I talked extensively about the toad and its relationship and how we view the importance of the toad. It is our ancestors, and the toad carries the bundles, the knowledge bundles of the ancestors, the one that walked before us. Today, we have been gifted with an albino toad that has moved in here. So we're going to try to take very good care of our visitor while he or she stays. We're so grateful that through that toad coming to visit, it has come to visit you as well. And all of the things, the hard and the good things that we heard today, the spirit of all of the people has just been tremendous. How you see and advocate for Choquette Earth Woman it's just overwhelming. I urge you not to stop. I urge you not to feel alone. And all of the colleagues here in this circle will help you. It is a responsibility to give thanks for the words that travel through the sky world, to the fire keepers, the bundle keepers of the spirit of the fire, to the women who look at the sacred water as life. For the toad that's come to sit with us, it's very necessary to say our miigwech song. And they come in prayer. It's not just a social song, there are social songs, but most of them are from the earth. Say miigwech to everyone. I wish you a good evening, good conversation. First with the Ojibway Earth Woman. You view the stars, give them thanks. Those are the men holding the sacred bundle of fire. We don't get lost when we have that lead, and they will always be there. And the goodness of all that came to visit today, I'll hold you always right here. The tears that flowed, that is healthy. That's compassion, that's love, that is respect. Okay, have some fun this evening, along with all the good food you're gonna eat. Have something for me, because I've got to go to Toronto now. Okay, until tomorrow, I'll